starting us off with number 10 is the chimney. This chilled me to my bone and also reminded me of Hannibal for some reason. Back in 2015, construction workers were demolishing an abandoned cabin in Woodland Park when they found skeletal remains inside the chimney. An odontologist identified the remains as belonging to Joshua Maddox. Joshua was 18 when he went on a walk on May 8, 2008 and never came home. His parents knew he was an avid nature lover and went for hikes often, so nothing really seemed out of the blue. When he failed to come home that night, his parents reported him missing a few days later. Days became months, months became years. They didn't understand where he could have gone. I mean, his IQ was very high, they knew it had to be something horrendous for him to go missing. The forest the cabin was in was searched extensively, but not the cabin itself. The worst part was that it was only 2 blocks away from his house. They assumed Josh was trying to shimmy down the chimney to get into the cabin but then got stuck. His body was found with his knees above his head and his hand covering his face. He definitely didn't die from starvation. It was either dehydration, which meant he died in a few days, or hypothermia, which also would have taken a day or 2. Just imagine, like, I'm sure he was yelling for help but no one could hear him. So claustrophobic, I just can't even imagine it. At least his family got closure though, and they finally found his body. Coming in at number 9 is the Runaway family. Back in 2016, a Norwegian man was hiking in the woods when he came across an abandoned family cabin. And I say cabin, but it was like a proper house cabin. Not just a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom thing, it was luxury. Okay, no, but you know what I mean. Thankfully, he had a camera with him, so he actually went inside assuming it'd be empty, but was eerily surprised. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned in a rush. Everything seemed to be where it was supposed to be. It was basically fully furnished. The only fact people were able to find out about the cabin was that it was abandoned in 2005, so the cabin looked exactly as it did when it was left. So many personal belongings were left inside, like wedding photos, clothes, etc. So it looked like the family planned to come back to the house, yet 11 years later they hadn't. Dishes left in the sink, random toys, books, clothes everywhere. It looked like whatever they deemed the most important is what they grabbed. The cabin's rooms just looked like they were frozen in time, and no one knows where this family is, why they left in such a hurry, and if they're even still alive. At number 8 we have the writing retreat. We all know writers sometimes go seclude themselves to get out of their writer's block, you know, maybe go to like a quiet Airbnb in Italy or by the beach in Barbados, not a murder cabin in the middle of nowhere, which is exactly what Tom Taylor decided to do. He booked himself at a remote cabin and recorded all the events that happened to him on his Twitter account. Despite being windy outside all night, the wind chimes outside the cabin only started sounding at 5:30 AM exactly. He went outside to take them off, but when he goes outside, the door slams behind him. Slightly freaked out, he reaches the chimes and takes them off when he hears the chimes sound again. And it clearly didn't come from the chimes in his hand, now did it? Next, as he's in bed, he hears a footstep which he thought was a kangaroo, and yes, he was in Australia, don't be alarmed, but he saw a human shadow outside the window. If that's not bad enough, a few minutes later his bedroom door flew open out of nowhere, and when he closed it and tried to open it again, the frickin' doorknob just came off. Unable to sleep, he was like, okay, let's just go right in the living room. He went to turn on the TV and it was just static. Honestly, I hope to God he was writing a horror book, cause there's your book right there. Your experience, right there you go. Filling our number 7 slot is the hanging. The Snelson Brinker House was a cabin located near Steelville, Missouri. It was built by Judge Levi Snelson and was actually Crawford County's first ever courthouse. I don't know why they made a cabin a courthouse, but fine. Years later, John Brinker owned the cabin and he lived with his 2 daughters and a slave called Mary who would take care of the girls. One day, 2-year-old Vienna was found dead and Mary was accused of drowning her. After trial, she was convicted for the murder, hung and buried near the cabin in an unmarked grave. The trial was so short and there was no evidence against her. She was seen as lesser than everyone else. As a slave, she was convicted. It said her spirit could never rest and it's still in the cabin today. Honestly, I'd also be pissed too if I got killed for something I didn't do. I'd also haunt the out of that cabin as well. Now at number 6 is the Dowry. I can barely call White Otter Castle a cabin even though it was like the mansion equivalent of a cabin at 3 stories and was built by Jimmy McCuwat. The castle even has a turret. Like which cabin has a turret? The cabin can really only be accessed by boat, snowmobile or plane, none of which are that convenient. the whole thing himself, and it took him a grueling 12 years to do it. He cut all the logs himself, he hoisted all the beams, it really was a one-man job. He wanted the home to be a dowry for his future bride, which he hadn't even met yet, like he wasn't even engaged. But before his dream could come true, he drowned in a fishing accident in 1918, and his body was found tangled in fishing nets the following year. He was buried near the castle, and many claim they've seen his ghost wander in and around the property. Honestly, I would too. He spent 12 years building it only to die 3 years after finishing it. That's such a waste of time. I'd be so pissed. I'd invite all my ghost homies and be like, listen, we're living and haunting here now. Coming in at number 5 is the Perfume. Located in Fort Worth, Texas, Log Cabin Village is actually a living history museum that includes 6 historic cabins, including the one in question, Foster Cabin. During the 1800s, the cabin was home to Harry Foster and his family, and his wife died in the middle of the 1800s at some point, the actual date isn't recorded, and Harry scandalously married his nanny Jane Holt afterwards. It's said Jane wore lilac perfume all the time, and any tourists that visit the cabin now say they can sometimes smell lilacs in certain areas of the house and hear phantom footsteps all around. Honestly, I'm glad it's just a smell in the cabin rather than a full-on haunting. Like, this cabin I could deal with, I could stay there. The other ones on the list, not so much, but I could do this one. At number 4 is Upstairs Entertainment. Now, Shamrock House was part of a 3-cabin compound, and it was built around 1925. Legend has it that a woman called Nancy and 2 of her friends were hired for the cabin to provide upstairs entertainment, and I'll just leave it at that for our PG viewers. At the last minute, Nancy got cold feet and changed her mind and decided to lock herself in the upstairs bathroom. Her father, who was a preacher, heard about the situation quickly after and made his way to Shamrock House as quickly as he possibly could. Nancy was absolutely terrified thinking about what her father would do to her when he got there, even though really, if anything, I feel like he was probably just going to get her out of there and make sure she was safe. But I mean, I could be totally wrong and naive. He could be very pissed and like about to hurt her, I don't really know. But before he could reach, Nancy overdosed on opium and died in the bathroom. Anyone that stays there now has reported hearing hushed cries during the night, which is said to be from Nancy's ghost. Filling our number 3 slot is the Machete Man. Every city has its own local ghost stories, and this one is from Raleigh, North Carolina. There's an abandoned cabin located at the Dead End Creek, and it's apparently haunted by a ghost called the Machete Man. A skeleton was found in the fridge of the cabin and was said to be one of his victims. During the summer, when kids would be out playing near the cabin, they would suddenly start feeling really cold and start hearing the rattling of chains and metal coming from the cabin. The sound was meant to be the machete blade in its scabbard, and when people heard that sound, it meant he had left the cabin and was wandering down Ivy Lane. Say no more, I don't need to be anywhere near a machete-wielding ghost, thank you very much. Now at number 2 is the Cabin of Sounds. Now, this cabin is located in Dufferin County, and despite it being a perfectly scenic location, none of the tenants have managed to stay there for long. It was first owned by a bone settler and then the Frame family, who lived there till the 1890s, and then it remained abandoned till its current owner bought it. The owner hired some woodcutters to stay in the cabin while they worked, but after they'd moved in, things started going awry. One night they heard banging at the front door and they assumed more workers had arrived, but before one of them could get to the door, the front door opened and closed by itself like some unseen person had just entered the cabin. After that, the men heard noises of people walking above them every single night. They started seeing entities outside the cabin, like weird lights outside the window, a fireball that used to surround the house and then rise above it. As the noises got worse, none of the residents were able to sleep. If they wanted a midnight snack, they'd see the dishes moving by themselves, chairs and beds would just get tossed around. It was havoc. These ghosts trashed the cabin so badly that even the ceiling came flaking off. Honestly, they should start paying rent if they're gonna trash it that badly. The Frame family had heard these sort of complaints from every tenant they had, and after an investigation, officers found human bones and amputations hidden in the attic, probably the work of the bone settler. Either way, it's safe to say the market value of that property has gone down the drain. And finally, at number 1 is Cabin 28. This one could be the next big Netflix docu-series, so just listen up. Located in the Keddy Resort in Sierra Nevada, Sue Sharp and her 5 kids and their friends were staying at some of the cabins cabins during April of 1981 for a nice holiday when the worst of the worst happened. On the morning of April 12, Sue's daughter Sheila walked into cabin 28 to find the bodies of her mother, her brother John, and their friend Dana. They had all been bound with tape and wire, and all three had suffered blunt force trauma to their heads. Bloody knives and a hammer were found near the bodies as well. 3 other kids were also staying in the cabin but remained unharmed, and Sue's other daughter Tina was nowhere to be found. She remained missing for 3 years until her skull and bones were found near Camp 18 near Feather Falls. The horrific quadruple homicide was never solved, and anyone that stayed in the cabin afterwards reported hearing moans and screams during the night, doors opening and closing, and weird light features that would appear and disappear out of nowhere. They say the victims haunt the cabin, which I totally agree with, but it was torn down in 2004, so I mean, I don't know if the ghosts now haunt the land the cabin used to be on, or if they've gone into the light. I don't really know. Starting us off at number 10 is The Note. This one actually scared me to my very core because of how creepy it is. I may be exaggerating, but it was scary. Shared by Redditor Killer Orange Cat, he said he's a very high up executive in a big business, so he's pretty much stressed all the time. In the few weeks he has off every year, he likes going out to cabins and just being isolated, catch up on some reading, you know how it goes. However, he stopped doing that a few years back after a harrowing experience. He rented a secluded cabin which was a 1.5 hour drive from the nearest town. There was no signal up there, no radio, just you and your regrets, really. Either way, one night he was on the porch reading a book when he heard a noise. He looked up to see a person in the trees nearby, and having expected hikers in the area, he wasn't that bothered. The man waved to the user and the user waved back, and then the man just walked off. A few hours later, the user heard rustling and looked up to see the man from before in the same place as before, just staring at him. This time he didn't wave or anything, he just creepily stared for a bit too long and then left again. Weirded out, the user went inside the cabin and locked the front door, and by 10 PM that night, he started hearing noises in the driveway. The user got a flashlight and went out to see some movements in the bushes and sort of ran back inside the cabin and locked the door. He went to bed, and during the night got up to pee and then went back to bed. When he finally woke up, he went into the living room and realized number 1, the front door was unlocked and open, and number 2, there was a note taped to the front door. It said, "You might want to keep a light on, you walked right past me for your piss break." He packed up his things 30 minutes later and was out like a light. And hence the user never again went on these stress relieving getaways, because let's face it, nothing about that story was stress relieving. I am stress induced. Coming in at number 9 is Blue Mountain. Back in 2013, 14-year-old Dylan Dakota Eastley was staying in a hunting cabin in Granite, Washington with his foster dad Michael Piet, his uncle Kenneth, and a few other men. On the night of October 2nd, police were called to the cabin and found the bodies of both older men full of gunshot wounds. Dylan was accused of the murders, but according to his testimony, both men stepped out to pee, and Dylan saw what he thought were wolf eyes in the darkness and then got a gun and started firing. Which, hello, is such a bad cover-up, like at least think of something more convincing than that. The shots that killed his uncle weren't even fired towards the woods, they were fired back into the cabin. The third man ran to the truck mid-shooting and decided to get help. Now Dylan at this point escaped from the cabin but accidentally shot himself in the leg, and so another man from the hunting party found him and duct taped him to a chair. The boy ended up confessing, and his uncle's wife went on to say had Dylan got his way, he would have probably shot everyone in the cabin. He has no remorse. Dylan, who had a history of mental problems and had been abused as a kid, apparently reached his breaking point at the cabin despite the foster family taking very good care of him. Honestly, I don't know what could have gotten into a 14-year-old boy's head to possess him to murder 2 people. And then he shot himself in the leg by accident. You're so young and so dumb. I feel bad for the kid because he ruined his life, but I also know I shouldn't, and I don't, but I do. And no, he's a killer. Cold-hearted killer. At number 8 we have The Ghost Cabin. So this story was shared by an anonymous person who said this happened to her when she was around 11 years old. Now back then she lived with her grandparents in a house surrounded by a lot of woods. She used to take walks into the woods all the time since she visited her grandparents every summer and was quite used to the area. Now one day while she was on her usual path, she walked a bit further than usual, so by that point it started getting quite dark outside. She decided to make her way back but somehow got lost. She couldn't recognize recognize any of her surroundings, and the more she tried to venture, the more lost she became. She eventually came upon a dirt path and started following it, hoping it would lead her out of the forest. Out of the forest it did not lead, instead it took her to an old cabin she'd never seen before. It was withered, overgrown with weeds, it was like the world was trying to forget about it. She knocked to see if anyone was in there, which she knew would be useless before she even did it. She went in and walked into a small bedroom which looked like it hadn't been used for years. The more she explored, the more she felt she was being watched everywhere she went. She reckoned she'd sleep there overnight and try and find her way back home when the sun came up. Either way, she fell asleep and woke up to the sound of a door slamming and someone walking through the house. The door to the bedroom opened and she saw this insanely tall figure who laughed this disgusting shrill sounding laugh, and then the figure vanished into the walls. Thinking she was royally screwed, she got up and ran towards the door and heard this loud breathing sound coming towards her, and then she passed out. She woke up in the middle of the woods and made her way home somehow. She assumed her grandparents would have been worried sick looking for her, but turns out she hadn't even been gone for 1 hour. The girl told them about what happened and they went pale and silent and convinced her she was just dreaming, and then they never mentioned it again. I feel like this is one of those glitch in the Matrix stories, like how did it become nightfall yet not even an hour had passed? Something's not adding up. There's a glitch in the Matrix. Filling our number 7 slot is the unwanted renter. So this was shared by an anonymous person who said around 2000 he went camping with his family and they rented out a cabin from the summer camp area. Most of the cabins in the area were built back in the 30s, so they were well maintained but never refurbished, so they were old as hell. Either way, on the second day the guy went for a walk with his brother, but things just felt off. His brother felt it too but couldn't put his finger on it, so they both just brushed it off and decided to continue their walk. A few minutes later they noticed the furthest cabin in the cluster had all its windows purposefully closed. They walked past it and all of a sudden the lights came on and they heard a huge thud. The brothers thought it was really weird, but also knew hunters used to rent out the cabins often, so they didn't really think too much about it. The next morning they were having breakfast with the camp director and asked him how many cabins he planned on renting and mentioned the cabin from the night before. The director replied by saying, "You need to call the police, we aren't even renting out any of the other cabins." The police came and after a 2-hour standoff arrested a man who had been illegally camping in the cabin for 3 weeks. He was unshaven, starving, he was armed with a shotgun and pistol, had 2 bags full of stolen valuables that he had taken during other violent break-ins. Just imagine the summer camp was actually running and you have this crazy man living in one of these cabins. Like, that's a safety hazard, if I do say so myself. Now at number 6 is the torture cabin, and I feel like this one carries with it a lot of speculation since nothing about this cabin is really known for sure. It was shared by Reddit user God Bullseye, who said he was hiking in rural Kentucky when he found a cabin. Kind of lost with no signal, he knocked on the door hoping whoever was inside could give him directions to the closest trail, but no one answered. Which in and of itself isn't scary because it easily could have been a holiday cabin, not a residential one. Either way, the user decided to look through the window as any curious human would, and he saw a very basic cabin. But when he scanned to his right, he saw this bed with leather restraints at each corner and a dog leash tied around the top of the headboard. Sort of like someone was leashed to the headboard. And I mean, honestly, this could be one of 2 things. The first is it really could have been a torture device, and if that's the case, let's hope whoever was leashed to the headboard didn't die. And the second thing is that someone just has very BDSM like kinks and fetishes, and if that's the case, we don't kink shame people here at Most Amazing Top 10. Let's just not kill anyone. Coming in at number 5 are the AKEMAN murders. Now depending on how old you are, you may have seen a show called Hee Haw from the 70s. It was a variety show that had a lot of country music in it, and one of the cast members was David String Bean AKEMAN. Him and his wife Estelle lived a modest life during the Great Depression. The only luxuries they really had was a car and a colored TV. They lived in a small cabin near Ridgetop, Tennessee, and AKEMAN was known to not trust banks, so because of that, rumors flew around that he kept a lot of cash at hand and hid a bunch of it in his home. Now on November 10th, 1973, the couple came home from a performance and was shot dead pretty much as soon as they got home. The killers had been waiting for hours, so they had ample time to ransack the whole cabin and find the money, but to no avail. They ended up stealing a few firearms and a chainsaw. Turns out the money was hidden in their chimney the whole time, and honestly this murder feels like a waste to me. I mean, I feel like if you're gonna murder a couple for their money, at least ask them where it is before you kill them. Let's not just pointlessly kill, let's at least kill for money, people. Hello? Not that I'm encouraging that, I'm just saying. At number 4 is the Porch Man. So this one was shared by an anonymous redditor who said growing up he used to go to this cabin with his family quite a bit, but by the time he turned 12 they stopped going. When the user turned 25, he learned that when his aunt died she had left the cabin for him, and so after inheriting it he sort of wanted to know what condition it was in. He went out there and on the way up the dirt road he saw the cabin. He hadn't turned into the driveway yet, but he was close enough to see someone was sitting on the porch swing. Confused, he backed up and assumed he had gotten the wrong cabin, but after double checking the address he was like, no, that was definitely it. He went back and saw the man was still there, and instead of getting out to talk to him he went back into town and asked the police to check it out before him. Which I mean is overcautious in my opinion, but I guess that worked out since God knows what would have happened to him had he got himself, and you'll find out why in a few minutes. Cliffhanger. The police go and check it out, and the user waits in a cafe in town. They take longer than expected to come back, and when they do they show him a picture inside a folder asking if that's the guy he saw. The user said yes, and the cops tell him that when the man saw them approach he ran into the cabin and resisted, so he had to be handcuffed. Turns out the porch swinger was wanted in California for murdering his girlfriend, and so he had been hiding in the cabin for months. When the police got there he thought they had finally found him, not knowing they had no idea who the hell he was. And honestly if that was what he did with the police, he really probably would have killed the guy had he driven up there himself. I mean, he already killed his girlfriend, what's this random guy? Just another number on the list. Filling our number 3 slot is the Cellar. This one was shared by another anonymous redditor who said during his second year of college he rented a cabin with his best friend Jack. The cabin was beautiful, it was isolated, it was near a lake, it was just perfect. Either way, the second morning they woke up, the user realized one of his sandwiches was missing. He assumed Jack ate it and asked him, and he insisted he hadn't. The user thought, okay, he either forgot or he doesn't want to tell me, it's whatever. That night he heard Jack moving around in the living room despite him having an A1 bladder and being a deep sleeper. He called out but no one answered, and the next morning another one of his sandwiches was gone. At this point he confronted Jack again, who claimed he hadn't eaten the sandwiches and he hadn't been up at night either. The user thought Jack was just messing with him, but that night he found it hard to sleep anyway. He saw that his bedroom door was a bit open and that someone was behind it. He ran to it and then to Jack's room to find him asleep in bed. At this point he was like, what the hell, and he even went outside and checked all around the cabin but found nothing. The next morning Jack again said, no, I was in bed all night, I didn't eat your sandwich mate, and I wasn't up. That night again the user heard noises and ran out again to find something or someone run across the room, and then he heard a massive slam. He flipped the light on as soon as possible and realized the noise came from a cellar door that he had never noticed. You've been there for 3 days, you didn't notice the cellar door? Alright, so realizing that, everything sort of fell into place and he realized this place is either haunted or someone's living in the frickin' cellar. The next day they called the police, who went into the cellar and produced a very sickly, skinny woman. She had apparently been stealing food from whoever came to stay there and had schizophrenia. She'd been in and out of psych wards her whole life and went back to one very quickly after she was caught. Now at number 2 are the Brooks murders. Paul and Margaret Brooks had been married for 50 plus years and had a bunch of children and grandchildren. I don't know why I sided with that, it's a bit irrelevant, but you know, it's a cute story. Back in early 2013, the couple was staying at a cabin in Lamp, Missouri. Lamp? LOMP? I'm not really sure. What was meant to be a quiet getaway turned into the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones. On the night of the 31st of January, Anthony Zarin and Christopher Allen escaped from a juvenile rehabilitation facility called Lives Under Construction Boys Ranch. The boys broke into the Brooks' cabin and bludgeoned the couple to death. They beat them with baseball bats and then stabbed them to death with knives. Keep in mind, Paul was 70 and Margaret was 69. Like, they were already super old. There was no need to be that brutal. I'm sure they were already dead when they got hit with the bats. There's no need for the knives. Either way, the Brooks' children blamed the Christian camp for at-risk youth who failed to alert any authorities or residents in the area that some of their teens had escaped. The teens had recently been taken off their psychiatric medication without the permission of a doctor, so I feel like there was just a lot going on here that just ended in brutality. Both teens confessed to murdering the couple at the age of 16 and 15 respectively and were sentenced to life in prison. And they deserve it. Monsters. And finally, at number 1 are the Good Heart murders. The Robertson family consisted of Richard and his wife Shirley and their 4 kids. In the middle of 1968, the family went for a vacation at their Lake Michigan cabin near Good Heart. The family were inside the cottage when 5 gunshots came through the window and hit Richard. The killer then entered through the back door and shot the rest of the family, making it a point to bludgeon Richard and their youngest child Susan to death with a hammer. The crime scene was then staged to make it look like a sexual attack rather than a mass murder, and since the cabin was isolated, the bodies weren't found for a full 27 days, and by that point they had decomposed quite a bit. Richard was reported missing 2 weeks after the murder, and the first suspect was his employee Joseph Scalaro, who had been MIA for 12 hours on the day of the murders and who also had no valid alibis. He'd even bought both weapons used in the murder, and afterwards it was found that $60,000 were missing from Richard's businesses. Joseph had been left in charge before he went on vacation, so clearly it was money motivated. After failing 2 lie detector tests, 4 years passed before the case was reopened, and when Joseph heard about the impending charges, he committed suicide. He left a note saying he was a liar but not a murderer. Well, I mean, if you weren't the murderer, then why did you buy the murder weapons? Just a basic question. Starting us off with number 10 is the family gathering. Back in December 1990, the Teed family went from Houston to a 2-story mountain cabin near Oakley for family holiday gathering. What they thought was going to be a fun Christmas away turned into something else entirely. Unbeknownst to them, when they got to the remote cabin, they were actually interrupting a burglary. The 2 culprits, Von Lester Taylor and Edward Deli, shot 2 of the family members to death, shot Rolf Teed in the face, abducted the Teed's 2 daughters, and then set the cabin on fire. Like they did the most. Nearby locals heard gunshots from that area and called police and said they saw 2 men flee the cabin with 2 women. The police got there and a 10-mile car chase ensued, but they managed to catch Taylor and Deli and the girls were finally safe. Whew. Whew. Coming in at number 9 is the head. This one sounds like it happened in the 18th century or something, but it actually happened in May of this year. Now this story focuses on Michael Cummins, a Tennessee local who was accused of 7 homicides and who was also living in Westmoreland at the time. On April 17th, James Fox Dunn Jr. was found dead in a burnt cabin outside the area. And you'd think the burnt cabin or the dead body would be the worst part, but really James was discovered without a head. Now his body was found at the cabin and his head was found somewhere nearby. Now authorities were unsure whether his head had been decapitated during the murder or had been separated by some process of decomposition, but I honestly highly doubt that it was clearly the former. Either way, Cummins was later arrested when 7 more bodies were found at 2 locations near the same area, a town which only has a population of 2,000, like the man is out here killing half the population already. The other bodies were found 10 days after Dunn's body was found, and authorities called it one of the worst mass killings in the state's history. At number 8 we have the cat. Back in September of 2009, Sherry Green was on her way to Winnipeg to her family's remote cabin with her cat for a nice weekend away. She had stopped at her sister's shop on the way there and they argued over the cat and whether it should be taken there or not. Either way, Sherry made her way to the cabin and the last contact anyone had with her was a text to her niece saying the cat was missing. Now Sherry herself wasn't married, she had no kids, she had no one to leave all she had to, so she wasn't really a prime target for anyone, but that in and of itself could have made her the perfect target. Either way, her niece hadn't heard from Sherry in a few days and so she got worried and called the landline at the cabin and Sherry's mobile, but to no avail. Sherry's sister Lisa decided to drive to the cabin to check on her and immediately they heard the cat meowing from inside. They walked in to find Sherry sitting on a chair in the kitchen facing away from them. When they turned the lights on, they found her leaning so much to the side that her hand was actually touching the floor. There was a huge gaping wound in her neck and the amount of blood on the floor implied she was most definitely dead. The case has now been closed for 10 years and people still have no idea who did it or why they did so. Filling our number 7 slot is the attack. Now back in November of 2019, a Quebec couple and their 10-month-old daughter was staying in a remote cabin between Yukon and the Northwest Territories in Canada. The couple were there for maternity leave and had been there for 3 months at this point. One Monday afternoon, the father came home from a walk to the cabin and found the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. As soon as he got there, he was charged by a massive grizzly bear 100 meters from the cabin. Now the father managed to shoot the bear before it got to him, before obviously going closer to the cabin and finding their bodies. The mum and baby were home alone at the time, but what I don't get is how the bear got into the cabin, and even if they were outside, I don't see how she couldn't have just carried the baby and ran back into the cabin and just locked the door. But I also don't know how fast bears run, like I didn't Google that and maybe it was a stealth attack or something, who knows. I believe if she could save both of them she would have. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I've never been attacked by a bear. I don't know these things. Now at number 6 is the Benicia teen. Back in October of 2015, Adam Buchanan, his fiancée and their son went to a cabin for a nice weekend getaway. Now their other son Nolan decided to stay back in Benicia, but on the 11th of September, Sheriff John D'Agostini found the cabin burning in the midst of a 10-acre wildfire in the area. When the fire was finally over, investigators found the remains of 3 people inside. Except they weren't just burnt alive, they had been shot beforehand. DNA testing confirmed that it was Adam, his fiancée and their child, and so the sheriff contacted Nolan, who told them he had stayed behind. A few days later, authorities arrived with a search warrant at their home and found contradicting evidence in the house, as well as Adam's wallet and his fiancée's purse in a nearby park. Shady, very, very shady. Nolan had apparently stayed behind and then driven to the cabin, killed his family, and then returned to Benicia like nothing had happened. And there was literally no motive released about why he did it. Like why did you do this, dude? I need to know. I feel like I'm on an episode of Forensic Files. Why did you do this, Nolan? Coming in at number 5 is CRESSLER Creek Log Cabin. Located near Hoxie, Kansas, the area used to be used as a field hospital during the Civil War, so you can imagine the amount of death that took place there. The area soaked up the blood, the pain and suffering of so many soldiers that many believe it draws the spirits of the dead towards it. Many people who have gone to visit the cabin have seen ghosts in bloody Civil War uniforms roaming the cabin and the woods around it at night. People have heard the sounds of rifles going off in the area despite no one really living there, so what exactly would the bullets be hitting? They also hear shouts from time to time of soldiers and their war cries. I feel like by now haunted cabins are like the least of our concerns with all these real murders and kidnappings going on, but number 5 is always just, you know, like a nice breather from the list anyway. We can breathe. And now we can get into number 4. At number 4 is the Corbin cabin. Now this cabin is located in the woods of Shenandoah National Park, and it's actually one of the last cabins standing since the park was created. George Corbin built the cabin in the early 1900s and lived there with his wife Nee. In 1924, tragedy struck and Nee died during childbirth, leaving George a heartbroken, inexperienced single dad. Apparently, as soon as she died, George had to walk 4 miles to get milk for his baby, and I mean, did he take the baby with him? Did he ever find the milk? I have no closure there. These days, it's one of the most haunted hikes in Virginia, and 90% of hikers have seen the ghost of CHIMNEY roaming around the cabin. She never strays too far away from it and chooses to be right by where her child was brought into the world. Unable to raise him, her spirit swore to protect the child always, in death or life evidently. Maternal instincts. Can't beat him. Filling our number 3 slot is the Bushman of VALEMOUNT. Back in September of 2014, Milton Ballon went to his otherwise empty cabin located south of VALEMOUNT. When he got there, the lock on the gate had been changed even though he owned the property and didn't change it himself. A man started walking towards him with a flashlight and said his name was John, but Milton was smarter than that and he knew exactly who he was. John Robert Bueller had been terrorizing locals in the area for months. Apparently him and his daughter had taken over a club's picnic area, the cabin, blocked a public trail, and even set their German shepherds on some horseback riders. Thankfully, Milton's neighbors in the area had told him about the situation before he'd even gotten there. He called the RCMP and a 4-hour standoff ensued where John used his dogs as protection while his daughter urged him to surrender. John had thrown all of Milton's belongings over a riverbank and filled the cabin with his own random things like cigarettes, tools, chicken feed even though they didn't have chickens, just weird things. He was told to leave many times nicely but didn't comply and kept saying, "We gotta talk, we gotta talk." John was a violent manic depressive who refused medication and Milton gave him 7 days to get off the property. A week later he came back and called the RCMP again and they shot John, killing him. I mean, I don't want to say he deserved it, but like, come on John, how many warnings do you need? Get off already! Get off my property! Now at number 2 is JAYME Kloss. When this girl was abducted, I saw the stories and news about it everywhere. 13-year-old JAYME was kidnapped in October of last year after the culprit killed her parents with a shotgun. Imagine being kidnapped right after your parents are killed. Like, are you more sad? Are you scared? Like, what would you even be feeling? Now, the culprit had seen JAYME get on her school bus and had sort of developed an infatuation with her ever since and planned to kidnap her. In January of this year, JAYME managed to escape the remote location where she was being held at and asked the first person she saw for help. She had information about her captor, 21-year-old Jake Thomas Patterson, and they caught him 10 minutes later. Efficiency. Jake was hiding himself and JAYME at a very remote, dingy cabin, and apparently he had grown up in a cabin 10 miles away from the cabin they were staying at. Apparently people in the area, even his high school teachers, had no idea he still lived in the area since he kept himself so isolated and hidden. Well, I'm glad justice was served in that one, even though 2 innocent people died, which we can't get back, but at least and JAYME survived. Half happy ending, half not. What do we think? And finally, at number 1 is DIAN FOSSEY. Now, DIAN was one of the world's most famous primatologists, and she was known for doing an extensive study of mountain gorilla groups for nearly 20 years. She studied them daily, published books on them, and she even lived in a cabin in the Virunga Mountains in Rwanda just to be even closer to her subjects. But on December 27, 1985, DIAN was found murdered in the bedroom of her cabin. Her body was found face up near a hole in the wall that had apparently been created by the assailants. Her research assistant was called to the house by the house servant and found DIAN bludgeoned to death. Her face was split diagonally open with a single machete blow. The cabin itself was an absolute mess. Glass was everywhere, furniture was flipped everywhere, but it wasn't a robbery. All her valuables were still there, and apparently it was a targeted killing. Now, DIAN used to capture Rwandans in the area that was suspected of poaching and low-key torture them, like beat their testicles with stinging nettles sort of torture. She was well liked and well hated by the local community, so the murder wasn't as big of a surprise as you'd think. Either way, her entire staff were arrested, including a tracker who had tried to kill her with a machete previously. All of them ended up being released except the tracker, who hung himself in prison. I mean, if you just waited a little longer, you may have been released as well, buddy.